From the hill at the edge of the village rose a mansion so vast it seemed to borrow the sky for its roof. White stone walls caught the sun each morning, and at dusk the windows glowed like a promise kept. It belonged to Elior Dane, the man everyone spoke of with a mixture of awe and gratitude, the man whose name was uttered the way one spoke of good fortune. Elior had inherited wealth, yes, but the village elders agreed that inheritance alone could not explain what he became. Many were born with silver spoons and dulled them through laziness. Elior sharpened his family's businesses: agriculture, transport, construction, turning modest ventures into thriving enterprises that employed half the village and fed the other half. Wherever his attention settled, growth followed, as if success recognized him and chose to linger. He rose before dawn, worked with a quiet intensity, and returned home long after the last ledger had been closed. People admired that discipline. They admired, too, that he never flaunted his wealth. His clothes were well made but simple, his words measured, his presence calm. When he walked through the market, traders straightened their backs, not out of fear but respect. His philanthropy became legend. Elior built 2 schools when the old one collapsed, and when the government failed to send teachers, he paid their salaries himself. He funded a small hospital, stocked its pharmacy, and visited patients personally, never with cameras, never with speeches. He came with fruit, warm meals, and a listening ear. To the sick and the poor, he was not a benefactor, he was a constant. Women noticed him, of course. How could they not? Wealth, kindness, restraint, these were intoxicating qualities. Some were subtle, lingering near him at gatherings, brushing hands where there was space to walk freely. Others were bold, arriving at his mansion under thin excuses and thinner smiles. There were even rumors of quarrels, women who resented one another for daring to hope. Elior noticed none of it, or so it seemed. He greeted everyone with the same polite warmth, never lingering, never encouraging. If he sensed the tension, he stepped away from it, redirecting conversations toward work, charity, or the future of the village. To many, this only increased his appeal. To others, it was puzzling. How can a man have everything and want nothing? People asked. They did not know that some kinds of wanting learned, very early, how to hide. And so the village slept easily, believing they understood the man on the hill, his mansion, his labor, his generosity, and aware that admiration, when unexamined, can become a curtain drawn tightly over the truth. Elior Dane learned early that a name could feel heavier than stone. His family's legacy followed him everywhere, into boardrooms scented with polished wood, into village meetings held under mango trees, into childhood memories where adults spoke over his head as if he were already a man. The Dane name opened doors before his hand reached the handle, but once inside, he worked harder than anyone to prove he deserved to be there. He expanded the businesses not through cruelty or shortcuts, but through patience. He listened to laborers who had never been asked their opinions. He studied soil patterns with farmers and transport routes with drivers who knew every pothole by heart. Profits grew slowly at first, then steadily, then abundantly. When money came, he treated it not as a trophy but as a tool. The mansion, though grand, was never loud. Its halls were quiet, its rooms orderly. He filled it with books instead of parties, maps instead of paintings. At night, light glowed from his study long after the village had gone dark. People passing the hill would point and say, "He is still working." It became a phrase of pride. Elior funded scholarships for children whose parents could not read, believing education was the only inheritance that multiplied when given away. When floods destroyed the lower farms, he rebuilt the storage barns without demanding repayment. When a teacher fell ill, he sent money anonymously, though everyone somehow knew it was him. The women who admired him often mistook his distance for humility, or perhaps shyness. Some believed he was waiting for a love as principled as his life. Others thought he simply feared distraction. They told themselves stories that made sense, stories that fit the man they wanted him to be. What no one questioned was his solitude. Elior ate most meals alone. He attended ceremonies briefly and left early. He never brought a companion to festivals. When asked about marriage, he smiled and said, "There is still much work to do." The answer satisfied most people. Purpose, after all, was his defining trait. Yet beneath the achievements, beneath the reputation so carefully earned, there was a silence in him that no amount of success seemed to fill. It was not the silence of peace, but of something unfinished, something formed long before the village began watching him so closely. And still, the village applauded, unaware that a man could give so much to the world and remain profoundly untouched by it. Power came to Elior not in bursts, but in layers. By his early 30s, his influence extended far beyond the village. Contracts were signed in distant cities, shipments moved across borders, and his name appeared in newspapers beside words like visionary and ethical entrepreneur. Yet when officials arrived to meet him, they were often surprised to find a man who spoke softly, asked more questions than he answered, and dismissed praise with an almost uncomfortable nod. What set Elior apart was not ambition alone, but restraint. He refused deals that smelled of exploitation. He walked away from partnerships that promised fast money at the cost of land, animals, or people. Growth should not rot what it touches, he once said at a regional forum, a line that was quoted for weeks afterward. The village benefited in ways both obvious and subtle. Roads were repaired without fanfare, wells were dug before droughts became disasters. Young men who might have drifted into crime found steady work instead. Mothers slept easier knowing their children could walk to school without crossing unsafe paths. Elior never announced these things, they simply happened, like the changing of seasons. At social events, women continued to circle him, some drawn by his wealth, others by his composure, others still by the mystery that clung to him like a second shadow. One sent handwritten letters filled with poetry. Another staged chance encounters at charity meetings. A third confronted him directly, declaring admiration with fearless clarity. Elior responded to all of it with the same gentle deflection. He thanked them, he listened, he stepped away. To the village, this made him almost unreal, a man, untouched by desire, governed only by duty. Mothers whispered that he would make a perfect husband. Fathers admired his discipline. If Elior had a talent greater than building wealth, it was knowing where to place it. He did not give blindly. He listened first. He sat with elders beneath trees, and with laborers on half-built sites, absorbing complaints that others dismissed as small. A cracked classroom wall, a midwife without supplies, a bridge that flooded every rainy season. Within weeks, sometimes days, solutions appeared, funded quietly, executed efficiently, and never announced as charity. People began to say Elior understood the village better than those who had lived there all their lives. Children knew him as the man who visited schools unannounced, asking questions that made them think instead of recite. Teachers respected him because he never interfered, only supported. When the hospital opened its new wing, nurses cried not during the ceremony, but months later, when medicines kept arriving even after public attention faded. Too many, his goodness felt deliberate, almost disciplined, as if kindness were a practice he refined daily. He remembered names, he followed up on promises, he never reminded anyone what he had done for them. Gratitude was offered freely, but he never seemed to need it. And yet, those closest to him noticed something unusual. Elior rarely accepted help in return. When neighbors offered to host him for meals, he declined politely. When friends suggested holidays or rest, he smiled and said work steadied him. Even celebrations held in his honor felt awkward, as though praise unsettled him more than criticism ever could. Women continued to hope. Some convinced themselves that his distance was a test that patience would be rewarded. Others grew bitter, accusing him of arrogance or emotional coldness. But even those who walked away spoke of him with a reluctant respect. He had never misled them, never promised what he could not give. The mansion remained a symbol of his success, yet few had seen beyond its receiving halls. Its inner rooms were closed, its routines precise, everything had its place. Disorder, it seemed, was not welcome there. Elior's life appeared full, overflowing even of purpose, achievement, and moral clarity. But those who paid close attention might have sensed that his generosity moved outward, never inward, as if he were feeding a world while quietly starving something within himself. Still, no one questioned him. After all, how could a man who gave so much possibly be hiding anything at all? By the time Elior turned 35, admiration had hardened into expectation. The village no longer asked if he would help, but when. When a roof collapsed, people waited. When a business failed, they hoped. When a young person showed promise, they quietly prayed Elior would notice. He almost always did. His attention felt like approval from fate itself. Public events increasingly revolved around him. He was invited to speak, to cut ribbons, to stand at the center of photographs meant to capture progress. Yet in every image there was something striking. Elior never leaned into the crowd. He stood just apart, close enough to belong, distant enough to remain untouched. Women continued to interpret this distance in their own ways. Some romanticized it, imagining themselves as the one who would finally draw him closer, soften the reserve, awaken a hidden tenderness. Others saw it as a challenge, escalating their efforts with elaborate gestures and calculated vulnerability. There was the jeweler's daughter who organized a fundraiser solely to work beside him, the widow who brought him home-cooked meals each week, lingering longer every time, the young lawyer who spoke openly of partnership, personal and professional alike. Whispers followed each attempt, and speculation filled the spaces he left behind. Elior responded with unfailing courtesy. He praised initiative, thanked kindness, acknowledged feelings without encouraging them. He never humiliated anyone, never gossiped, never exploited affection. If anything, his restraint made rejection harder to resent. He is married to his work, people concluded. And so the applause continued, measured, respectful, constant. Elior became less a man and more an idea, discipline, success, virtue embodied. The kind of figure people used to correct their children or inspire their own ambitions. What no one noticed was how carefully he curated this image, how much effort it took to remain exactly what everyone needed him to be. The distance was not accidental. It was maintained, reinforced, protected. In a world that felt increasingly entitled to his time, his money, and even his future, Elior guarded something fiercely, something no one had ever been invited to see. For now, the village clapped, confident they understood him. They did not yet realize that distance, when perfected, can hide almost anything. Long before the mansion crowned the hill, before the businesses and the applause, Elior lived in a house that was already too large for him. He was born into abundance. Servants anticipated his needs before he learned to speak them. Meals appeared when he was hungry, Toys when he was bored, tutors when he struggled. Nothing material was ever withheld. Yet the house echoed with a particular kind of absence one no amount of wealth could furnish. His parents were figures of motion rather than presence. Meetings, flights, conferences, negotiations, these were the constants of his childhood. They loved him, no one doubted that, but their love arrived in gestures, gifts left behind, messages relayed through staff, promises of time that were endlessly postponed. There were no siblings to fill the silence, no one to compete with or confide in. Elior learned early to be self-contained. The only beings that responded to him without schedules or expectations were the animals kept on the family's land. Horses that leaned into his touch, dogs that followed him without question, cattle that recognized his voice. Among them he felt something rare and uncomplicated. Attention without demand, closeness without conversation. Adults praised this affection. He has a gentle hand, they said. Animals trust him. It became another admirable trait, another proof of his character. No one thought to look closer. Why would they? In a world where everything else was managed for him, this seemed harmless, even healthy. As he grew older, discipline replaced loneliness. He filled his days with structure, his nights with study. Success became a language he could speak fluently, one that earned approval where words never had. The absence of his parents hardened into independence, then into resolve. He would never need to ask for attention again. But some habits, once formed in isolation, do not dissolve simply because life becomes full. The village saw the result of Elior's adulthood, his control, his generosity, his restraint, and assumed it had always been so. They did not see the quiet origins of his inner world, or how early comfort can shape later silence in ways no one thinks to question. And so, as Elior stood admired by many and intimately known by none, the foundations of everything he was, visible and invisible, were already firmly set. Beyond the mansion and its quiet order lay another place Elior cherished even more, the ranch. It stretched wide and green, fenced carefully, tended with a precision that mirrored his businesses. Horses grazed freely, cattle moved calmly, goats clustered along gentle slopes, and birds nested without fear. The ranch was not run for spectacle or profit alone. It was structured for balance. Animals were well fed, rarely stressed, and visibly healthy. Veterinarians spoke highly of the conditions. Visitors remarked that there was a calm to the land that felt almost deliberate. Elior spent long hours there, often alone. He walked the fields at dawn, checked water troughs himself, and learned the patterns of every creature under his care. He knew which horse startled easily, which cow lagged behind the herd, which dog preferred silence to affection. His attentiveness was meticulous, almost reverent. To the villagers, this only deepened their admiration. He understands living things, they said. That's why everything he touches thrives. Children were brought on visits to learn responsibility. Farmers sought his advice. He invested in better breeding practices, safer shelters, and ethical treatment long before such things became fashionable. When disease threatened neighboring ranches, his remained untouched, protected by foresight and care. Elior rarely spoke while at the ranch. Here, words felt unnecessary. The animals did not ask questions or expect explanations. They did not compare him to anyone else. In their presence, he did not need to perform generosity or discipline. He simply was. It was here that the villagers most trusted him. A man gentle with animals, they believed, must surely be gentle in all things. And so the ranch became another symbol of his virtue, a living extension of the man they thought they knew. No one lingered long enough to wonder why Elior preferred the company of creatures to people, or why he sometimes stayed for days, returning to the village quieter than before. They saw harmony. They did not think to ask what solitude, left unexamined, might slowly become. Luck seemed to follow Elior the way shadows followed light. At the ranch, everything flourished. Calves were born strong, crops grown nearby, resisted pests, even seasons that punished others spared his land. Farmers began to joke half seriously that Elior carried favor in his hands. What he touched endured. What he nurtured multiplied. He reinvested relentlessly. New barns rose where old ones sagged. Advanced equipment replaced worn tools. He funded research into animal health, bringing in specialists who marveled at how little correction his systems required. Most people chase profit, one expert told him. You chase balance. Elior only nodded. The animals responded to him in ways others found uncanny. Horses calmed at his presence. Dogs watched him with unwavering focus. Even the most skittish creatures allowed his approach. Visitors remarked on it often, and Elior accepted the praise without comment, as though it described something ordinary. To the village, the ranch became proof that kindness could be practical. Children were taught that care brought reward, that patience produced abundance. Elders pointed to Elior's land when speaking of stewardship and responsibility. His reputation widened, deepened, and hardened into certainty. Yet Elior himself felt none of the surprise others did. The ranch was not luck to him. It was refuge. Away from the gaze of expectation, away from the constant gratitude and quiet demands. He felt a loosening he experienced nowhere else. Days passed without conversation. Nights fell without interruption. Time behaved differently there, stretching, softening, folding in on itself. When he stayed for several days at a time, the village barely questioned it. He works too hard, they said. This is how he rests, and perhaps that was true, in part. Work and rest had long blurred for him into the same controlled rhythm. What no one could see was how deeply the ranch had become entwined with his inner life, how it was no longer just a place of care, but of concealment, a space where the rules of the world felt distant, and the boundaries that governed other parts of his life seemed, gradually, too thin. For now, fortune still smiled. The land remained generous. The animals thrived, and Elior's name continued to stand for goodness untouched by suspicion, unquestioned by those who believed that success and virtue always traveled together. Elior's bond with the animals deepened in ways no ledger could record. He learned their rhythms so completely that caretakers deferred to him without question. If he said an animal should be separated, it was done. If he insisted on privacy in certain sections of the ranch, no one challenged it. His reputation insulated him. Trust, once earned, became permission. At dusk, when workers left and the land exhaled into quiet, Elior remained. He spoke softly then, not in commands, but in murmurs meant for no one else. The animals listened in their way, responding with calm presence, unafraid, unresisting. To Elior, that wordless closeness felt purer than any human connection he had ever known. There were no expectations here, no performances, no disappointments. Villagers occasionally noticed how deeply he seemed attached to particular animals, how he remembered their smallest injuries, how he refused to sell them even when offered generous sums. He's sentimental, people said with a smile. That's his nature. Kindness, after all, often looked like excess to those who did not practice it. Yet some caretakers felt a quiet discomfort they could not explain. Nothing concrete, nothing they could name, just a sense that Elior's presence lingered too long after the work was done, that his attention sometimes crossed an invisible line between stewardship and something harder to define. They never spoke of it. In a village built on gratitude, suspicion felt like betrayal, and who would dare question a man whose generosity had shaped their lives, whose name paid their wages, educated their children, healed their sick? Elior continued to give, continued to build, continued to be admired. But beneath the calm of the ranch, beneath the flawless systems and thriving animals, something unspoken had taken root, a private world without witnesses, protected by silence and trust. And silence, when it lasts long enough, can begin to feel like safety. What Elior valued most at the ranch was not the labor or even the success, it was control without resistance. Here nothing challenged him. The animals followed routine, responded to care, accepted his presence without question. In their predictability, he found relief from a world that constantly projected meaning onto him. No one at the ranch asked who he would marry, what legacy he would leave, or whether he ever felt lonely. There were no mirrors held up to his inner life. Control, he told himself, was not cruelty, it was order. It was responsibility. He justified his long stays as necessity. Expansion plans, health monitoring, night observations. The caretakers believed him because it fit the pattern of the man they knew: thorough, tireless, exacting. When he dismissed staff early or locked certain gates after sunset, no one argued. Trust had long replaced oversight. In the village, his absence was interpreted generously. He sacrifices comfort for duty, people said. Women who once hoped for his attention now spoke of him with softened resignation. If he had chosen solitude, it was surely in service of something greater. Elior encouraged these assumptions by never correcting them. In truth, the ranch had become the only place where his carefully constructed identity loosened. The rules that governed his public life, restraint, virtue, distance, felt less rigid there. Alone, unobserved, he allowed himself to linger in moments others would have hurried past. To feel a closeness he could not translate into words or explain without breaking the image that protected him. He did not think of himself as broken. He thought of himself as different, misunderstood by a world that only recognized acceptable forms of desire and connection. The secrecy, he believed, harmed no one so long as it remained hidden. And so he returned again and again to the ranch, convinced that privacy was the same as harmlessness, and that control, once mastered, could keep even the most dangerous parts of a person safely contained. The village slept peacefully, unaware that the greatest risk had never been malice but the quiet confidence of a man who believed his secrets were beyond consequence. Night altered the ranch in ways daylight never could. When the last worker left and the gates were secured, Elior did not follow. He moved differently, then slower, deliberate, carrying a lantern into sections of the ranch no one else entered after dusk. Some enclosures were kept deliberately isolated, far from the others, shielded from sound and sight. He said it was for focus, for order. Animals under his personal care were separated, handled only by him, their routines altered without explanation. He spent long stretches with them in silence, studying reactions others never noticed, lingering where a caretaker would have finished and moved on. The boundaries that governed ordinary stewardship softened in the dark. There was no resistance, no language to object, only dependence. That dependence settled something restless inside him. Elior told himself he was not harming anything. Everything was fed, everything lived, everything bore the mark of his protection. Whatever passed between him and the animals during those hours felt private rather than cruel, contained rather than dangerous. He never wrote down what happened after the lamps were lit. By morning, the ranch returned to its careful harmony. Animals appeared calm. Systems ran flawlessly. Any changes were subtle enough to escape notice. If questions arose, his authority dissolved them before they fully formed. In the village, his absence was explained kindly. Work, responsibility, discipline. Women spoke of his restraint as virtue. Elders praised his devotion. Faith, they believed, kept him distant from temptation. No one thought to wonder what kind of devotion required so much darkness. Elior believed secrecy made his actions harmless, that because no one saw, no one was hurt. But secrecy does not erase consequence, it only delays it. And somewhere within the quiet order of the ranch, something irreversible had already taken shape, waiting for the moment it would no longer remain unseen. The first cracks did not come from accusation, but from discomfort. It began with one of the younger ranch hands, a boy who had grown up around animals and knew their moods the way sailors knew tides. He could not explain what troubled him, only that certain enclosures felt wrong now, not damaged, not neglected, just altered. The animals inside were quieter than before, less responsive, as though something in them had learned to wait. He mentioned it once, casually, to an older caretaker. The man shrugged it off. "Elior knows what he's doing," he said, and the conversation ended there. Trust was easier than doubt, but the feeling persisted. Animals once kept in shared spaces were now isolated for long periods. Some avoided touch altogether, flinching not from pain but anticipation. When caretakers asked if routines should be restored, Elior declined calmly, citing observation schedules and long-term outcomes. His explanations were precise, confident, impossible to challenge without sounding foolish, and no one wanted to sound foolish questioning a man who had given them so much. At the village, Elior's prolonged stays at the ranch became normal. He missed gatherings, declined invitations. His mansion lights remained off for days at a time. When he did return, he appeared composed but distant, as though something had followed him back and settled just beneath his skin. A few women noticed the change. The restraint they once admired now felt like withdrawal. One of them, Mara, young and restless, more curious than cautious, began to wonder what truly occupied his nights away, not out of concern for him, but out of resentment. Wealth had drawn her interest, not virtue, and distance felt like rejection. She told herself she deserved answers. Late one evening, when the village slept, and the ranch lay dark except for a single, steady light, Mara made a decision she would later wish she could undo. She wrapped herself in the confidence of secrecy and headed toward the land everyone trusted too much to watch closely. What she believed she would find was simple: solitude, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps a man finally revealed as ordinary. What she was about to witness would fracture that belief forever, because some truths do not announce themselves loudly. They wait quiet, content until someone steps where they were never meant to see. Mara expected many things as she crossed the ranch that night: loneliness, secrecy, even disappointment. She did not expect stillness so heavy it felt intentional. The farther she walked, the more the familiar sounds of the ranch disappeared. No rustling, no restless movement, only a single enclosure lit from within, its glow spilling weakly onto the ground like something struggling to remain contained. She slowed, suddenly aware that she was no longer curious but uneasy. At first, she heard nothing. Then movement, not frantic, not violent, just prolonged, deliberate, the kind of sound that suggested time had lost its meaning inside that space. Mara stepped closer. What she saw did not arrive all at once. It revealed itself in fragments: posture, proximity, an intimacy that did not belong. The way boundaries had been erased so completely that the scene no longer fit into any category her mind could safely name. Her breath caught, her body reacted before her thoughts could. Revulsion rose not from what she understood, but from what she could not. Elior turned for a fraction of a second. The man the village admired stood frozen in the light, exposed not by accusation but by presence. Mara ran. He called after her, not sharply, not threateningly, but urgently, as if explanation could undo what had already been seen. He followed for a few steps, then stopped. Some instincts, even then, knew the damage was complete. By morning the ranch looked unchanged. Animals were fed, gates were locked, but Mara did not. Her shock hardened into certainty, then into resolve. What she had witnessed could not be folded into silence, no matter how powerful the man, no matter how generous his past. By nightfall she stood before the elders, shaking, struggling to speak without breaking. Words failed her often. She described only what she could bear to name: the closeness, the secrecy, the violation of something sacred and defenseless. That was enough, because when trust collapses, it does not need detail to shatter. And far beyond the ranch, beyond the village, the first ripple of Elior's carefully guarded life began to move outward, unstoppable, irreversible, and finally seen. The elders listened in silence, the kind that presses down on the chest. Mara's words came haltingly, fractured by disbelief and shamed at hers, but the kind that clings to anyone who has seen something that should not exist. She could not describe everything. She did not need to. What she conveyed was enough to unmoor the room. Secrecy where there should have been care, closeness where there should have been distance, a misuse of trust so profound it defied explanation. At first, denial rose instinctively. They spoke Elior's name as though it might correct the accusation on its own. They listed his schools, his hospital, his generosity. One elder wept openly, not for the truth, but for the impossibility of it. A man so good, so disciplined, how could he be capable of something so deeply wrong? But doubt, once planted, does not remain small. Questions followed, quiet ones at first. Why certain enclosures were restricted, why animals had been isolated without records, why Elior insisted on absolute privacy at night. Patterns that once felt like diligence now rearranged themselves into something far less innocent. By dawn, the village had changed. People spoke in whispers, mothers pulled children closer. Ranch workers avoided one another's eyes, each wondering what they had missed or chosen not to see. Trust did not vanish all at once. It cracked, spreading unevenly, but relentlessly. Elior was summoned. He arrived composed, as always, dressed neatly, his expression calm enough to feel rehearsed. He listened without interruption as the elders spoke, not accusing, not forgiving, only asking him to explain what no one wanted to believe. When he answered, his words were careful. He spoke of misunderstanding, of privacy mistaken for harm, of a bond with living things that others lacked the depth to comprehend. He never denied the closeness, he only denied its wrongness. That was when the room fell truly silent. Because morality, once explained away, reveals itself more clearly than any confession. By evening, the elders reached a decision they never imagined making. Authorities would be notified, oversight would come, the ranch would be closed. Outside, the village waited, no longer reverent, no longer grateful, but stunned by the realization that goodness, when placed too high above scrutiny, can rot without anyone noticing. And Elior, standing alone in his mansion that night, felt for the first time what it was to be truly seen and not forgiven. What began as a whisper in a small room did not remain there. By the time authorities arrived, the village was already fractured. Gates were sealed. The ranch stood silent, its once ordered calm replaced by an oppressive stillness. Officials spoke carefully, avoiding language that would ignite panic, but restraint only sharpened curiosity. Rumors escaped faster than facts ever could. Within days, the story crossed borders. News outlets struggled to frame it. Philanthropist under investigation, model entrepreneur accused of unthinkable violations. Commentators argued on screens, their words circling the truth without daring to land on it. Some defended Elior fiercely, listing his contributions as though generosity could be weighed against wrongdoing. Others recoiled, demanding answers no one yet had. The internet did what the village never had it dissected. Old interviews were replayed, photos scrutinized, his solitude reinterpreted, his love for animals, once praised, now read with a sickening irony. Every success became suspect, every silence ominous. The image he had curated so carefully was taken apart by strangers who felt no gratitude and owed him no loyalty. Elior did not speak. His lawyers issued brief statements. Investigations were ongoing. Allegations were misrepresented. He remained inside his mansion. Gates locked, phones unanswered. The house that once symbolized achievement now felt like a mausoleum, vast, echoing, and hostile to breath. Charities suspended his name. Schools quietly removed plaques. The hospital he built issued a statement distancing itself from its founder. People who once owed their livelihoods to him now avoided speaking his name aloud, as if it might stain their tongues. And still, more details surfaced. Former workers came forward not with accusations they could clearly define, but with memories that now made sense in hindsight. Restrictions, odd instructions. The way discomfort had been swallowed because questioning him felt ungrateful. The world watched with a hunger that felt almost cruel. Elior, who had spent his life controlling what was seen, now learned what it meant to be exposed without language to defend himself. There were no explanations that could restore what had been lost. No amount of good that could quiet the question everyone now asked in some form. How long had this been happening, and how did no one see it? Alone in his mansion, Elior woke each morning to silence thicker than any accusation. The admiration that once insulated him had vanished, replaced by something colder than hatred. It was absence, and in that absence, for the first time in his life, there was no one left to protect him from the world, or from himself. The mansion did not change, but it stopped welcoming him. Rooms that once felt orderly now seemed cavernous, their silence no longer chosen but imposed. Elior moved through the halls like a visitor who had overstayed, touching furniture as if to reassure himself that it was still real. The walls bore photographs of ceremonies, handshakes, smiling faces, evidence of a life that had already detached itself from him. Sleep came unevenly. When it did, it brought no rest. He woke each morning to the same routine, stripped of purpose. No schedules awaited him. No workers needed instruction. No land required oversight. The phone that once rang incessantly lay untouched, its stillness louder than any crowd. Elior told himself he was enduring a misunderstanding. That clarity would come. That his years of discipline and generosity would reassert themselves. But even as he rehearsed these thoughts, he felt how thin they were. The world had not paused to consider his intent. It had moved on, leaving him sealed inside a version of himself no one wished to know. Outside the gates, life continued deliberately without him. Children attended schools that no longer spoke his name. The hospital functioned under new leadership. Businesses quietly restructured, disentangling themselves from his influence. It was as though the village were practicing how to exist after erasure. Elior watched this from behind glass. Isolation, once a refuge, now pressed inward. He realized how little of himself he had ever shared, how all connection had flowed outward, never back. The admiration he had mistaken for belonging had vanished, and nothing stood beneath it. In the quiet, memories surfaced uninvited. Long childhood afternoons alone, animals that responded when people did not, control mistaken for closeness. He did not excuse himself, but neither did he fully condemn what he could no longer undo. Instead, he felt something more corrosive than guilt or relevance. The world had discovered him and decided it could proceed without him. And for a man who had built his entire life on being necessary, that realization cut deeper than any punishment yet to come. As night fell, Elior stood at a window overlooking darkened land he no longer owned in truth, understanding at last that the mansion was not protecting him, it was containing him. Time stopped behaving properly after that. Days passed without distinction, each one folding into the next until Elior could no longer say what morning belonged to which night. He ate when hunger became unavoidable, slept when exhaustion overtook him, and spent the hours in between wandering the mansion like a man tracing the outline of a life that no longer fit. The outside world reached him only in fragments. Headlines glimpsed briefly before he turned away. Legal notices delivered without conversation. Former associates communicating through intermediaries, their language stripped of warmth and memory. Even condemnation, when it came, felt impersonal, procedural, distant, final. No one came to see him. Those who once praised him now avoided even the road that passed his gates. The women who had competed for his attention disappeared entirely, their affection revealed for what it had always been, conditional. The gratitude of the village, which he had mistaken for connection, dissolved the moment his name became dangerous to speak. Elior began to understand something he had never allowed himself to face. He had never been known only useful in the absence of witnesses. His thoughts grew louder. He replayed moments from the ranch, not to relive them, but to examine where certainty had overtaken restraint, where silence had felt like permission, where he had stopped asking whether something should be done and focused only on whether it could. He did not frame these reflections as confession, nor as remorse in the way the world might demand it. They arrived instead as a bleak clarity, the realization that whatever he had believed himself to be, he had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed, and the cost was not merely reputation, it was meaning. The mansion, once proof of success, now felt like evidence submitted too late. His wealth could not buy anonymity. His past generosity could not negotiate forgiveness. His discipline could not restore order to a life that had collapsed inward. Some nights he stood in the largest room and listened to the echo of his own breathing, wondering how a man surrounded by so much space could feel so utterly confined. He had spent his life avoiding scrutiny, believing solitude was strength. Now alone in a house built to impress the world, Elior faced the quiet truth he could no longer outrun. Isolation, chosen long enough, eventually chooses you back. Eventually the days slowed. Not because life improved, but because Elior's mind could no longer sustain the constant churn of reflection. Thoughts that once arrived sharp and accusatory began to dull, settling into a heavy, persistent awareness. This, he realized, was what remained when everything else had been stripped away. Consequences. The legal process moved forward without urgency or spectacle. There were interviews conducted through attorneys, assessments carried out by people who never met his eyes, documents cataloging his life into neutral language. Nothing in those pages captured who he had believed himself to be. They described actions, patterns, breaches of trust, nothing more. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part. His story no longer belonged to him. Outside, seasons shifted. The land beyond his walls changed color, then changed again. He watched from a distance, struck by how little his absence altered the rhythm of the world. The village adapted. New benefactors emerged. Needs once filled by him were met by others. Slower, perhaps, but collectively he was not irreplaceable. That truth settled deeply, eroding the last fragments of pride he had mistaken for purpose. What he had built endured, but without his presence attached. His name faded from daily speech, surviving only in records and cautionary references. At night, when the house was quiet enough to hear its own settling, Elior found himself confronting a question he had avoided all his life: who he was without function, without control, without secrecy. There was no satisfying answer. He understood now that the hunger he had tried to manage through order and domination had never been about animals, or land, or work. It had been about absence, about a void formed too early and left unattended too long. But understanding did not absolve him. Insight arrived late, stripped of usefulness. The mansion still stood, his wealth still existed, his body still moved through space. But the future, the thing he had always assumed would bend to his discipline, had closed itself off, indifferent to explanation. Elior sat with that knowledge, heavy and inescapable, realizing that punishment was not always loud or immediate. Sometimes, it was simply being left with what you had become. The world eventually stopped asking anything of him. No more notices arrived at the gate. No more statements were requested. Even the distant murmur of public outrage softened, replaced by newer scandals, fresher names. Elior's story receded into archives and cautionary footnotes. recalled only when someone needed an example of how far a man could fall. He became, at last, invisible. Within the mansion, objects outlived intention. Books remained unread. Rooms stayed closed for weeks. Dust gathered without resistance. Elior no longer corrected it. Order, once his language of control, had lost its meaning. There was no audience to reassure, no image to maintain. He began spending long hours seated in a single chair near the back of the house, facing a window that overlooked nothing of consequence. Sometimes he thought of the ranch not with longing, but with a strange detachment, as though it had belonged to someone else, a different man, a man he could now observe without fully recognizing. Memories arrived uninvited, not of success, but of childhood stillness, of waiting rooms and empty halls, of learning early that attention had to be earned, not expected. He saw how carefully he had constructed a life where he would never have to ask for closeness again, only obedience, only silence, and how disastrously that had failed. There were moments when regret surfaced sharply, not as self-pity but as awareness, the knowledge that he had been given countless chances to stop, to question himself, to seek help instead of refuge in secrecy. He had chosen control instead. That choice echoed now in every quiet corner of the house. Elior understood that redemption, if it existed at all, would not come in the form he once believed in: no rebuilding, no grand correction, no return to usefulness. Some fractures did not heal into strength, they simply remained. As evening fell, he watched the light fade without marking the hour. There was no anticipation of tomorrow, no dread either, just continuation. A life once defined by influence had narrowed into recollection, and memory, he learned, could be its own kind of confinement. In time, even memory lost its sharpness. Elior woke one morning to a quiet that felt less accusatory than before. The house no longer echoed with judgment. It simply existed. He moved through it slowly, not searching for purpose, not resisting the emptiness, only acknowledging it. Outside, the world continued without him, steady and unconcerned. Children grew into adults who knew his name only vaguely, if at all. The schools he built stood without plaques. The hospital functioned without mention of its founder. What endured was not him, but what others had carried forward. This, he realized, was the final truth of his life. He had believed that impact required presence, that influence secured meaning. But what remained after his erasure was something quieter. Structures others inhabited, paths others walked, benefits no longer tied to gratitude. The good he had done persisted without redeeming him. There was no final reckoning, no dramatic end, only aging, only days accumulating without ceremony. His body slowed, his world narrowed. The mansion became less a monument and more a shell housing a man who no longer mistook isolation for strength. In his last clear moments, Elior understood something he had never allowed himself to learn early enough. Care without accountability becomes harm. Silence mistaken for trust becomes permission. And power, when never questioned, will always turn inward. When he was gone, there were no crowds, no arguments about legacy, just a quiet passing noted in a registry, another name added to a long list of lives lived and concluded. What endured was not the man, but the lesson others took from his absence, that admiration must never replace scrutiny, and that goodness, to remain good, must be willing to be seen. And so the story ended not with forgiveness or vengeance, but with awareness arriving too late for one man, and just in time for everyone else.